A billionaire expected a problem, but what he saw on the sidewalk changed his son's future forever. The billionaire's name was Richard Hale, a man whose name appeared on skyscrapers, hospitals, and business magazines. His life ran on schedules tighter than vault locks. That afternoon, his driver stopped the car outside an elite private academy to pick up Richard's 10-year-old son, Ethan. Richard rarely did school pickups himself, but today, a canceled meeting gave him an unexpected hour. As he waited, something caught his eye across the street. On the sidewalk near a closed cafe sat a homeless boy no older than 13. His clothes were worn, his shoes mismatched. Between him and Ethan, who had wandered over while Richard was distracted, was a chessboard, scratched and missing a few pieces. Richard's first instinct was irritation. Why was his son talking to a homeless kid? Then he watched. The homeless boy wasn't begging. He wasn't asking for money. He was teaching. "Don't rush the queen," the boy said gently. "In chess, power comes from patience." Nodded seriously, moving his pawn back, Richard frowned. This wasn't a random street game. This was a lesson. Richard stepped out of the car, his presence commanding attention even without words. "Ethan," he called. "What's going on?" Ethan looked up, excited. "Dad, this is Leo. He's really good at chess. He says it's like life, you have to think ahead." Richard's gaze moved to the boy. Leo stood slowly, respectful but unafraid. "I hope I didn't do anything wrong, sir." Richard studied him, the calm voice, the clear eyes, the confidence that didn't beg for approval. "How do you know chess?" Richard asked. Leo hesitated. "My mom taught me. She used to say it was the only game where poor and rich start with the same pieces." That sentence hit harder than any sales pitch Richard had ever heard. Still, his instincts were sharp. "Where are your parents now?" Leo lowered his eyes. "My mom passed away. My dad left a long time ago." Hung between them, Richard nodded once. "Ethan, get in the car," protested. "But Dad," now, as the car pulled away, Richard glanced back. Leo was already packing up the board, alone.
That night, Richard couldn't sleep, no matter how many times he turned the pillow over to find a cool side or checked the darkened hallway to reassure himself the house was quiet. The scene replayed in his mind with unsettling clarity, the way Leo's fingers moved across the board with calm certainty, the way Ethan's eyes lit up with a focus Richard had rarely seen, the way strategy had been explained not with arrogance but with patience. Richard had spent a lifetime believing that the best teachers came with credentials, offices, and invoices. His son had private tutors for mathematics, piano, languages, debate, every skill money could outsource. Yet a boy on a cracked sidewalk, using a battered chessboard, had taught Ethan more in minutes than all of them combined. The realization bothered Richard far more than the loss of pride he'd felt earlier that day. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more, but by morning the question still clung to him like a shadow that refused to disappear. Why would someone give something valuable away for free? The next day, instead of heading straight to his office, Richard found himself driving back to the same street, slowing down as if afraid the moment had been a fluke, something that would vanish under daylight. But Leo was there again, same spot, same board, same quiet confidence as pieces clicked softly against wood. This time Richard told Ethan to wait in the car. He stepped out alone, the pavement feeling different beneath his polished shoes, as though he were crossing an invisible boundary. Leo glanced up and recognized him instantly, his expression neutral, unreadable. "I owe you an apology," Richard said, surprised by how heavy the words felt as they left his mouth. "I judged you too quickly." Leo shrugged, not offended, not triumphant, just honest. "Happens a lot." Richard crouched down, ignoring the unfamiliar discomfort in his knees, trying to meet Leo at eye level instead of towering over him. "Why teach my son for free?" he asked, the question escaping before he could dress it up with caution. Leo paused, his hand resting on a knight as if weighing more than the next move. Then he smiled slightly, not a grin but something softer, edged with memory. "Because he wanted to learn," he said, simple as that. After a beat he added, "and because chess helped me survive when everything else fell apart." The words landed harder than Richard expected, opening a door he hadn't meant to touch. He studied Leo's face and saw not laziness or entitlement, but resilience shaped by something unspoken. Richard sat down across from him, the concrete cold even through his tailored trousers, and gestured at the board. "Play me." Leo raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement passing through his eyes. "Are you sure?" Richard nodded, confident in his intellect if not his experience. The game began, and within minutes Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. His pieces were being outmaneuvered with quiet precision, traps unfolding before he even recognized them. 10 minutes later, he was losing badly, not because Leo rushed him, but because every mistake Richard made had been anticipated long before. As Richard stared at the board, a strange mix of humility and clarity washed over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about winning, about appearances, or about control. He was thinking about learning, about how much he still didn't know, and about a question that had followed him back to this street and now refused to let him go. What else had he been wrong about, simply because he'd never bothered to sit down and see the board from the other side? Over the next week, Richard kept coming back, not announcing himself, not making a show of it, just appearing on the same stretch of sidewalk as if it had quietly become part of his routine. Sometimes he sat down to play, rolling up the sleeves of his tailored shirts, trying and failing to hide how seriously he took each move. Sometimes he stood a few steps back, hands in his pockets, simply watching Leo teach other curious passers-by or replay old games against himself with unwavering focus. The more time Richard spent there, the more the image he'd first formed began to crumble. Leo wasn't lazy or irresponsible, as Richard had assumed on that first day. He noticed the small details most people ignored. Late in the evening, after the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, Leo would disappear behind a nearby restaurant and return with a quiet nod, having washed dishes for hours in exchange for leftover food wrapped in foil. Richard saw him carefully fold a thin blanket and tuck it into his backpack, sleeping wherever he could find a safe corner for the night. He watched Leo read borrowed books with the same intensity he brought to the chessboard, fingers tracing passages as if committing them to memory, returning the books days later without bent pages or marks. Leo didn't complain. He didn't beg. He dreamed quietly, talking once, when he thought no one was really listening, about studying game theory, about becoming a grandmaster, about teaching kids who never got a chance, because no one bothered to sit down with them. Each day, Richard felt something shift inside him, an unease mixed with respect, a growing awareness that success and struggle weren't always separated by effort or intelligence, but often by opportunity. One afternoon, after a long game that ended in a draw that felt more like a lesson than a victory, Richard took a breath and said the words he'd been rehearsing in his mind all morning. "I can get you into school, tutors, a place to live." Leo's body stiffened instantly, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing with a familiar defensiveness that told Richard this wasn't the first time such an offer had come with strings attached. "I don't want charity," Leo said flatly, pushing his chair back as if ready to walk away. Richard didn't rush to correct him. He nodded slowly, accepting the boundary. "Then don't take charity," he replied calmly. He reached into his briefcase and slid a folder across the table, its edges neat, deliberate. "I want you to be my son's chess coach, paid fairly." Leo hesitated, suspicion warring with curiosity, then opened the folder and read every word with painstaking care, scanning the terms, the hours, the compensation, the expectations, making sure nothing was hidden between the lines. Richard waited without interrupting, aware that trust couldn't be rushed, especially when it had been broken so many times before. Finally, Leo closed the folder, looked up, and extended his hand. Richard took it, the handshake firm, steady, equal. In that simple gesture, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of dignity, of earned respect rather than pity. That handshake changed everything, not just for Leo, whose life was about to open in ways he'd only imagined, but for Richard as well, who realized in that moment that the most unexpected move he'd made all week wasn't on a chessboard at all, but in choosing to see someone not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth believing in. Months later, the ballroom hosting the National Youth Chess Tournament buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric, the kind that comes when talent, pressure, and possibility collide in one place. Rows of boards stretched beneath bright lights, pieces aligned with ceremonial precision, while parents whispered prayers and coaches murmured last-minute advice. Cameras followed Ethan Hale as he moved from table to table, his posture calm, his expression focused far beyond his years. One by one, his opponents fell, not to reckless aggression, but to patient, suffocating strategy. Each victory drew louder applause, more flashing lights, more murmurs from commentators who struggled to understand how a boy once dismissed as merely privileged was now dismantling the nation's best young players with clinical brilliance. When Ethan finally claimed the championship, reporters swarmed him, microphones pressing close, voices overlapping with questions about training, discipline, and the pressure of living up to a famous last name. Ethan listened politely, then pointed past the cameras toward the sidelines. "Him," he said simply. Confused, reporters turned to see Leo standing there, no longer the boy from the sidewalk, but not pretending to be anyone else either. He wore a simple, well-fitted suit, his hair neatly combed, his posture confident yet reserved. There was no trace of arrogance in his expression, only quiet pride and a hint of disbelief at how far things had come. Cameras snapped again, faster now, drawn to the contrast, to the story forming in real time. By the next morning, headlines flooded screens and newspapers across the country. Billionaire hires former homeless boy as chess coach. From sidewalk to spotlight. The coach no one saw coming. Social media exploded with clips of Ethan's games, slow-motion analyses of moves that commentators now traced back to Leo's influence. But beneath the noise, something deeper was stirring. Days later, a press conference was announced, and speculation ran wild. Some expected a congratulatory speech, others a defensive statement addressing the attention. Instead, Richard Hale stepped onto the stage with a gravity that silenced the room. He spoke not of trophies or rankings, but of missed potential, of systems that failed quietly every day. Then he announced the launch of the Equal Board Initiative, a nationwide program designed to provide education, stable housing, mentorship, and long-term support to homeless children with academic promise, not as charity, but as investment. The room shifted from curiosity to stunned silence. Cameras rolled as Richard paused, then added one final sentence, his voice steady but unmistakably changed. "And this program exists because a boy with nothing taught my son everything about thinking ahead." At that moment, Leo stepped forward and stood beside him, not in the shadow, not as a symbol to be displayed, but as a partner whose insight had reshaped a future. He wasn't introduced as a success story or an exception. He was introduced as proof. Proof that brilliance doesn't belong to one neighborhood, one income bracket, or one family name. Proof that sometimes the most powerful moves are made not on a chessboard, but when someone finally decides to see the world as it is, and imagine what it could be if everyone was given a fair chance to play. The autumn rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the penthouse study, a soft percussion that blended with the low crackle of the fireplace. Outside, Karachi's skyline glittered through the haze, towers of glass and steel that had multiplied in the decade since Leo last slept under bridge. Inside, the room smelled of old books, sandalwood, and the faint citrus of Ethan's cologne. Leo sat at the rosewood chess table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the faint scar on his left forearm catching the lamplight, a souvenir from a night when a broken bottle had nearly ended more than his pride. Across from him, Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin resting on interlaced fingers, studying the board with the same quiet intensity he once used to study quarterly reports. The position was brutal. Leo's black pieces had coiled around Ethan's white king like a python. A knight on f3, bishop pair slicing diagonals, queen lurking on the h-file. Ethan's king had only two legal moves, both fatal. Ethan exhaled through his nose, half laugh, half sigh. "You still beat me." Leo's mouth curved, not the street-hardened smirk of years ago, but something softer, earned. "Because life taught me to play defense before offense." He reached across and nudged his rook one square forward. The click of wood on wood sounded final. "Checkmate." Ethan stared at the board another long moment, then sat back in the leather chair and raised both hands in surrender. "I don't know why I keep agreeing to these games. Ego, probably. Or optimism," Leo said. "You always think this time you'll spot the fork before I do." Ethan chuckled. "Optimism is just glorified denial. You taught me that too." They both glanced toward the far corner of the room. Richard stood near the bookshelf, arms folded, shoulder against the wall. He wore a charcoal sweater instead of the tailored suits that had once been his armor. The silver at his temples had spread, the lines around his eyes had deepened. But the gaze was the same, sharp, assessing, and these days kinder. He hadn't spoken since they started the game 40 minutes earlier. He rarely interrupted anymore. He had learned, slowly, painfully, that listening was sometimes the most powerful move on any board. Leo rose, stretched, vertebrae popping after hours hunched over lectures and mentoring sessions. He crossed to the sideboard and poured 3 glasses of single malt, none for show, just quiet ritual. He carried 2 back and offered one to Ethan, then took the third to Richard. Richard accepted it with a small nod, their fingers brushed, no words, none needed. Leo returned to his chair but didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the table, looking between the 2 men who had, in very different ways, saved him. 10 years earlier, he had been 19, filthy, shivering under a flyover on Shahri Faisal, telling himself the hunger was temporary. Pride had kept his mouth shut when charity vans rolled by. Anger had kept his fists clenched when security guards moved him along. Hope had almost disappeared entirely. Then a black Mercedes S-Class had slowed on the service road. Not stopped at first, just slowed. The tinted window descended halfway. A face Leo vaguely recognized from billboards and business pages stared out, not with pity, not with disgust, but with something closer to recognition. As though the man behind the wheel had seen that same hollow look in a mirror once, long ago. Richard had not offered money that first night. He had offered a question. When was the last time someone asked what you want to become? Leo had laughed, bitter and short. Nobody asks street kids what they want to become. They ask how much we cost to disappear. Richard had not flinched. Then I'm asking. Leo had given no answer that night, but he had climbed into the passenger seat when the door opened. One decision, one move, the beginning of an entirely different game. The years that followed were neither fairy tale nor nightmare, just hard, unglamorous work. Tutors paid in secret. Entrance exam coaching at 3 a.m. after night shifts at a call center Richard pretended not to know about. A small flat in Clifton, rent mysteriously always covered. A scholarship letter Leo knew he hadn't earned on marks alone. And through it all, Richard never once said, "Look what I did for you." He simply stayed in the background, watching moves unfold. Ethan had come later. The boy Leo once tutored in basic algebra under a neem tree had grown into a man who controlled 3 listed companies before 30. Yet the same Ethan still sent Leo memes at 2 a.m., still asked permission before hugging him in public, still lost spectacularly at chess every time they met. Tonight was no different. Ethan swirled the whiskey in his glass. "You know what I realized last month?" Leo raised an eyebrow. "I was sitting in a board meeting, everyone arguing about hostile takeovers and poison pills, and I thought, none of this matters as much as the fact that the guy who taught me how to castle under pressure is now teaching kids in Liari how to do the same." Leo looked down at the board, at the fallen White King. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm 29, Ethan protested. "Ancient." Richard finally spoke, voice low and gravelly from years of boardroom commands. "He's right, though." Both younger men turned. Richard stepped away from the wall, came closer to the table. He set his untouched glass down and placed one hand on the back of Ethan's chair, the other on Leo's shoulder. The weight was light, but steady. "I spent 40 years chasing checkmates in conference rooms," he said. "Leveraged buyouts, market corners, hostile bids. Every time I won, the board got bigger, the numbers got longer, and the quiet inside got louder. Until one evening I drove past a kid sleeping in cardboard and realized I didn't know the first thing about winning." He looked at Leo. "I didn't save you, son. You saved me from thinking that winning meant owning more pieces than the other guy." Leo swallowed. The word son still landed like a quiet detonation, even after all this time. Richard turned to Ethan. "And you were supposed to be my legacy. Instead you became something better. You became kind when you could have chosen ruthless. You stayed loyal when you could have walked away richer." Ethan blinked rapidly, pretending it was the smoke from the fire. Richard looked back at the chessboard. The black pieces stood victorious. The white ones lay scattered like fallen soldiers. "I used to think checkmate was about trapping the king," he said. Now I think it's about freeing everyone else on the board. Silence settled, comfortable and complete. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass. Leo lifted his glass to bad players who keep trying. Ethan clinked his own against it, to teachers who never give up on terrible students. Richard raised his at last, to the day I stopped the car. 3 glasses met in the middle, above the checkmated board. Somewhere in the city below, another boy was sleeping under a bridge, dreaming of moves he didn't yet know how to make. Somewhere else, a father was driving home, distracted, tired, until he slowed, looked, and perhaps, just perhaps, asked a question. And high above the glittering lights, 3 men stood together, not as savior and saved, not as mentor and protege, not as rich and poor, but simply as players who had finally learned the only rule that truly matters. The best move isn't always the one that wins the game. Sometimes it's the one that lets everyone keep playing. Checkmate.